Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the October ERM Toolbox webinar. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. One, if you've dialed in by phone but haven't yet logged in by computer and you'd like to see the slides that will be presented during the webinar, please point your web browser to readytalk.com. In the box where it says Participant Join a Meeting, enter the same access code that you used to join the call, 9879821. Please stay aware of the level of background noise in your area, and if it becomes noisy, please put your phone on mute. If you are called away from your phone, please do not put your phone on hold, as that will cause your hold music to be transmitted to everybody else on the call. You can simply hang up, dial back in when you're free, and it will not disrupt the call. We are leaving the phone lines open and unmuted for now. If you have questions, you can ask them that way, or you can use the chat box in the lower left of your screen. Just type a question in, and when the presenter has a moment, she will address it. If you need to mute your phone and your phone does not have a mute button, the ReadyTalk conference controls to mute a phone line from your end are *6 to mute it and *7 to unmute it. I'll also be monitoring the lines and can step in if there are any technical problems or if anybody's line needs to be muted and they can't handle it from their end. So with that, I will hand the controls over to Dorothy Gjerdrum. Dorothy?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you today, although for me, it's good afternoon because I'm actually calling you from Minnesota, which is where I am home based. So the reason I'm doing this, my credentials for this, is that I'm the chair of the United States Technical Advisory Committee to ISO 31000 and also now to ISO 31004. And so that's really what we're going to focus on here this morning, is to talk a little bit about the background of it and then also talk about where we're going next. So this is an introduction to ISO 31000. I do want to say ISO stands for it's a Swiss-based organization. It stands for International Standards Organization, as opposed to the Insurance Services Office, which might be another ISO with which you are familiar. I don't know exactly why this is, but it seems like in the field of risk management, there are lots of acronyms that mean multiple things. So I will try to stay really clear about that, but please, if I say something and it's not clear exactly which thing I'm referring to, please send a note through the chat box and keep me honest. Make me be sure that I'm doing that properly so everybody can understand. So let's take a look at the agenda for today. And I did forget to say one thing, so let me back up and say I've got experience as a practicing risk manager. I did that for 10 years for an Association of Counties pool, and we created new coverages, and we expanded our risk management oversight, and we did lots of cool stuff while I was there. And now I'm with Arthur J. Gallagher, and Gallagher is one of the largest brokers in the world, and my focus is really not so much on insurance brokering, but rather on risk management. And I do some ERM consulting as well. So I've got a fair amount of experience in the public sector and a bit more in higher ed as well. So that's how I come to you. The agenda for today. We're going to talk about the history of the process itself, how ISO 31000 got adopted. We're going to do a brief overview of ISO and brief comparison to COSO. And I put in this few things comparing ISO and COSO because I know that when Grace Cricket started the ERM process for your whole system, it was based on the COSO model because honestly at that time that's all there was. I've also been a co-speaker with Grace recently, and I know that she's sort of moving a little bit towards ISO, or at least allowing for that to be considered as a framework as well. And they're certainly not incompatible, but there are a few key differences that I will highlight. And I'll also talk about some of the other standards that exist globally and maybe some of the things that you could look to or pull from them. And then we'll talk about moving forward and what the ISO 31004 project is all about. So ISO, as I mentioned, based in Switzerland, it's a network of 159 countries. So every country can have a standards institute, and then they can designate standards development organizations. And those folks send individual 1 or 2 or 3 delegates to meetings, work group meetings, where all people from all different countries come together to try to hammer out language relating to standards. You might have heard of ISO before because a lot of people have heard of ISO 9000, which is a management standard. There are tons of standards. If you ever want to go to the ISO website, and the website's listed there, there's on all kinds of operations, on management, on safety issues. So there are lots of standards being developed all the time by a very broad representation of countries and industries. Now, ISO formed the 31000 technical committee back in about 2005, I think, 2004 or 2005, and we, the United States, were not interested, and we didn't participate until late 2008, and then at the meeting that was in 2009. And in part, let me first of all say ANSI stands for the American National Standards Institute, so that's the standards body that officially can communicate with ISO. And then what ANSI does is ANSI turns to its standards development organizations and says to them, would you like to participate in this standard that's being created? So they did that back in 2005, 2006, and people in the U.S. said, no, we're not interested in anybody telling us how to practice risk management. So we said no. They tried again as the standard kept moving and kept being developed, and by about 2008 it was looking like this really is going to get adopted. Finally, the U.S. said, we need to be at this table and find out what's coming. So I'm thankful that the American Society of Safety Engineers stepped up and said, yes, we will be the Standard Development Organization, the SDO, for ISO 31000. And so then ASSE turned to its membership to recruit people to be on the committee. So, and it says TAG, so this is like acronyms ahoy here today. I'm sorry about that, but TAG stands for Technical Advisory Group. So that's the official group in the U.S. that provides comments to the draft standards that are created at this international work group level. So I am the chair of the U.S. TAG, and I'll just sort of quickly tell you about how that happened, because I actually got into this process not without any intention of leading it. But it was a situation where I had a colleague who does a lot of work with the American Society of Safety Engineers, and he knew that I'm really passionate about risk management. So he heard that they were forming this technical advisory group, and he gave me a call one day. Said, Dorothy, I think you should do this. And my first question was, okay, Jim, that sounds really interesting, but how much time will it take? He assured me, oh, not so much. You're just going to do a few phone calls. You'll review a few documents. It'll be great. I said, sure, okay, I'll be on the TAG. So I got my approval from everybody within Gallagher, and I went ahead. And then he called me back a couple weeks later, and he said, Dorothy, it turns out they need a vice chair for this technical advisory group. And I said, well, really, Jim, how much time is that going to take? That seems like a much bigger commitment, and I'm pretty busy as it is. He said, oh, no. You just fill in when the chair can't lead a meeting, a teleconference. I said, well, okay, I think I could do that. And then, 20 minutes later, the chair resigned. So there I am, the accidental, as they call it, the accidental chair of the U.S. 31000 Technical Advisory Group. But it's been a great experience for me, and I have to say I've learned a lot about risk management, even though I've been practicing it for 20-some years. I've learned a lot from listening to how it is practiced in other countries. So that is helpful in this process. You can see that the vice chair is from RIMS, the Risk and Insurance Management Society, and there are 26 member organizations on our TAG, and you'll see a list here of who they are. These were the original members when we were looking at ISO 31000, and if a lot of these names are not familiar to you, let me assure you, it's really, think about ASSE, which is Society of Safety Engineers. It's very much based in manufacturing, in production, in industry, and there are robotics firms represented here. So these are folks who are used to contributing to sort of industrial safety regulations and standards. So it was a bit of a mismatch at the beginning. Since 2009, we've been adding some more members, and the next slide shows you some of the new members in the group, and that includes some from the federal government, which has actually a very active federal ERM initiative going, and they have an active group, and you can Google it, you can find out about it, but it's pretty interesting what they're doing. A lot of utilities, Department of Homeland Security, of course, National Institutes of Health, the Department of Commerce. So I gave a presentation about a week ago to the Institute of Internal Auditors, and I made this comment about the federal agencies being involved, and people in the audience were quite surprised to hear it. But they're doing some very good work. We have expanded the roster to include more practicing risk managers, which was a goal of mine in terms of contributing to the development of this standard. So, Emily, I just heard a loud beep. Should I be concerned about that?
No, that's nothing to worry about.
Okay. Well, here's how ISO 31000 itself came to be. Australia, probably some of you know this, they had a standard called 4360. It was Australia and New Zealand together on the practice of risk management. Australia, excuse me, and Japan got together and wanted to take that to the next level and really kind of push it out and offer it to other countries. They'd been getting lots of requests and interest about the process. So that's the genesis, really, of 31000. It's expanded upon, and I would say that the Australia-New Zealand standard 4360 is gone now. It doesn't really exist anymore because now they've turned and adopted 31000 instead. There were, you could see, 30-plus countries that participated over this about 5-year period. We were present only at the very last meeting, the 6th meeting, so we didn't get a lot of change made to the standard to have it, be a little bit more in concordance with our U.S. Risk management practices, but we got a few. And I would say that our participation was welcomed even though it was very late, and now that we're participating in the next round, it's been really great for everybody to be sharing what the risk management practices look like country to country. Just to give you a quick example of that, in a couple of countries, Germany is one example, when they adopt a standard like this and at an international level and then they go back to their country, the country immediately adopts it and basically turns it into law, which means that everybody has to comply with it. That is not the case for most countries. It is not written to be a certification standard, but rather something that is voluntary and guidance. But hearing about all the different countries' experience with it has been really interesting. In Japan, after we adopted 31000, the Japanese delegates had to go back and actually create a new word in Japanese in order to address one particular technical aspect of the standard itself. So it's a rich process because all of those countries participate. It was adopted in 2009, November of 2009, and then a few months after that, it was also adopted by ANSI, which remember is the American National Standards Institute. So it's actually the American standard on the practice of risk management as well. Now I'm very quickly going to tell you there are actually 3 component parts. One is the risk management process, the principles and guidelines. That's 31000. But as we were drafting it, the group realized that there were a lot of models out there for risk assessment techniques, and more than they wanted to load into the 31000 standard itself. So then they created ISO 31010, which is really a listing of all the different techniques that can be used to implement risk management. And they include, everything from brainstorming to stochastic modeling to every kind of risk assessment techniques that's really, some of them only applied to very certain industries, but it's a very good catalog of those techniques. And then Guide 73 is just the listing of all the vocabulary. Now, if you were interested in going to buy this standard, I recommend you go to either the ASSC website or the ANSI website, and I think both of them are listed here somewhere anyway. If you and it's about $130 for all three of them, but you don't have to buy all three. And if the risk assessment tools seem like too much, you don't need them. You could just get 31,000, and you would have all the defined terms contained within 31,000. The Guide 73 has got a few terms, risk-related terms, that aren't used in 31,000 because, of course, there are lots of standards that touch on risk. So that's why there are three of them. Okay, I'm having a slight pause in my computer here. I'm hoping.
Dorothy, we have a question in the chat box. What is Z690 2011?
Z690 2011 is the ANSI code for 31,000. So it's the same thing as ISO 31,000. It's just the numbering that's used by ANSI. And what I'm starting to see is that all of those linked together. So you might see ISO 31,000/Z690. And the Z690 series is the same as the ISO 31,000, 31,010, and Guide 73. Thank you very much for highlighting that, Emily, because I wasn't really looking at the chat box. I appreciate the help. Okay, here is a quote from the standard itself talking about the scope. What is really relevant about this is that it's intended to set out the principles and the guidelines and not necessarily give you detailed pieces of how to implement, which is why we've come to the point of adopting, now we're creating an implementation guide. But we wanted it to be applicable to all sizes of organization, all types of organization, and not specific to any industry or any sector. And we also, as I said before, it is not a compliance standard. So that is an important point because as soon as you dictate exactly how something has to be implemented, then it becomes much more rigid and dogmatic, and we know that risk management is not either of those things. Risk management has to be tailored to your organization, has to be very applicable to how you do your business and how your organization is structured, or else it's not going to be successful. So here are some of the highlights of the standard itself. It is quite easy to read and understand. It was intentionally written in very, I would say, sort of plain language, language that would be understood by any reader who could understand English. It's a proactive approach and not compliance-driven, as I mentioned a couple times already. It does emphasize that you need commitment at the very top, and that you need, if not a champion, you need at least a mandate and strong commitment to implement this so that you can apply it broadly across the organization. It does a very good job of linking to strategy and objectives. In fact, every time you're going to undertake a risk management process, you start there. You start with defining the context and talking about objectives. And I'll show you that in a slide in just a couple minutes and highlight how we do that. It does allow for, now I think this language is a bit limiting, so I apologize for using upside and downside, but really we're talking about opportunities and we're talking about adversities, things that could help you achieve objectives or help you do a better job at something, and things that would keep you from achieving your objectives. So it addresses both of those. I think the COSO model, for example, kind of mentions that, but then there are other instances where they don't spend as much time focused on the opportunity side of it. And then again, it is a consistent approach that can be applied no matter the size of the organization or the type of the organization. All right.
Wait a minute.
I jumped ahead. What I hope you're looking at next is a slide called The Whole Process. And it's got, I just want to first of all say there are really three aspects to the standard. One is, why are we doing this? and that is outlined in the principles. There are 11 principles, and they're described quite well in the standard itself. It is the reason that we're doing risk management. It is how it is linked and why it is important to link to objectives and to strategy. It's about bringing value to the organization. These principles, and you'll see them all listed in just a moment, but these principles are really important and helpful both as you're talking about why should we take a broader approach to risk and maybe trying to talk people into it or help them understand why you're doing it. And they're also very important as we're going through the process of reviewing how successful we are being at our ERM process. So as we're implementing risk management and we're asking the question, are we doing what we intended to do? Are we succeeding at it? And it gives us a chance to continually improve the process. So the principles help ground us in all of those activities. Bless you. The framework itself is how we're going to do this in your particular organization. So the framework is, and you'll see the details of it in a moment, but it is really to make sure that we've got a sustainable process over time. And it is to be sure that we've got the right people at the table and that we've talked about stakeholders and that we've got a policy in place that will support the actions that we're taking and so on. So the framework is making it sustainable over time, making sure we've got the commitment in place or we know what we're going to do to get the commitment and so on. And then the process itself is going to be familiar to all of you, and anybody who's trained in traditional risk management or familiar with the COSO cube, it's the process of talking about the context, assessing risk, and then identifying risk, assessing risk, figuring out what you're going to do about it, and then taking steps to treat the risk or to manage it in whatever way you're going to do that. Continually, you are monitoring and reviewing how are we doing. This is the plan. Are we proceeding on the plan? You're making adjustments as you need, and then you are also communicating as you go to appropriate stakeholders along the way. So here are the details, and it is, okay, I'm sorry, I had to make my screen larger because my old eyes thought the principles looked very tiny. So I apologize if those are hard to read for you guys, but hopefully you'll have this PowerPoint that you can print out and take a look at in bigger type at whatever point you need to. So you see the principles listed there, the individual ones including creating value for the organization, making sure over time, it takes a while to implement, anywhere from I'd say 2 to 5 years probably, but over time that you're integrating the management of risk into organizational processes, you're integrating it into decision making. This framework allows you to create a process to really address uncertainty, and that's a very important word. I'm going to get to it in just a couple of slides, so hang in there. We'll talk about that shortly. And then other things, I won't go through every single principle there, but making sure that it is relevant to the organization and tailored to the organization's use. And just a quick example of that, one client of mine that's implementing enterprise risk management is a very large city-county. As a matter of fact, it's a joint city-county, and they are implementing it with their enterprises first. So they've got enterprises that provide power and water and deal with wastewater, and they've got enterprises that have that operate a port and that have transit operations. And so in those enterprises, we're taking them through creating the framework, identifying risk and taking them through the risk management process for their key risks. And so the process is the same every time we do it, although it's who's involved and how large the oversight group is, that might change enterprise by enterprise. So you have to tailor it to what's going to work in that particular organization. Another example, a community college district, they have a risk advisory group, committee, and that committee is working with and selecting a group of employees and faculty members, and I think they'll even have students, so a wide group of stakeholders who will participate in a workshop to talk through and identify risks. And so in that case, it's not a department-specific focus or an enterprise-specific focus, but it's across the organization as a whole. So it has to be tailored to what's going to work in your organization. The framework itself is the middle portion. I think this is so key. I think that in the U.S., we've been really good and very focused on the risk management process, which is the whole group on the far right. And we've been doing that for 30 years or more, sort of explicitly doing it for about 35 years, where we identify risks and analyze them, evaluate them, et cetera. But we haven't been as diligent or as good as some other countries have been in making the links across multiple silos, if that's a word that you connect to, or different parts of the organization. So it means that, I work with public sector clients every day, and it means that I go to a large county and they've got one group handling their workers' comp risk. They've got another group focused on bloodborne pathogens. They might have somebody else that is focused on one particular department or law enforcement, and they're not all connected. So that's one problem. They're not all connected. The second problem is they're not sharing what they learn from one part of the organization with the other part of the organization, so they're not really able to continually improve it. So I think although we've done a good job of managing risk using the really essentially the steps on the far right, we haven't been as good at linking them all together and linking them to objectives in particular.
Dorothy,
there's a question posed, and I want to acknowledge that the question is there, but I'm going to hold off on answering it for just a little longer until we get a few more slides into the presentation, so I hope that that's acceptable. But I won't forget you, I promise. Okay. So looking at the framework itself, I just want you to follow the circle around. So you have to start with your mandate and commitment. Why are we doing this? Who is leading the charge? And then we're going to design the framework. So we're going to decide, are we going to do it enterprise by enterprise? Are we going to try to do it broadly across the organization? How are we going to actually put this in place? What policies do we need? What action steps do we need? What kind of oversight or committee and accountability? All of those things are answered in this part. And then when we start to actually implement it, what we do is we then want to take a look at what the key risks are. I'm using that word kind of intentionally because usually if an organization is starting this process and trying to take a look beyond just a traditional risk management approach, but take a look very broadly across the organization, what they want to do is create a register or a broad identification of all the risks that exist. And if you start with, for example, doing a workshop where you invite people and you talk about the things they're worried about, and then you write them all down, you do some brainstorming, you might end up with a group of 50 to 80 risks, which is a lot to manage. So then typically you have to go through some prioritization process and you figure out some way to rank them and to evaluate, are we doing enough to address this risk or not? That whole process is in the risk management process itself is designed by your framework, like how we're going to approach it and who we're going to do, and then how we're going to report it back. So you jump over to the risk management process to identify risks and evaluate them and figure out if you're doing enough and what more you need to do. And then you go back to the framework to say, okay, now how are we communicating this? Are the appropriate stakeholders involved? And what else do we need to do? And how can we improve this process? So it's the continual improvement model is really what's in the center. The process of actually managing either an individual risk or a whole portfolio of risks is really outlined in the process itself. I'll give you just one last quick example of that. A community college client of mine had done a really good job of educating people about the risk management process so that when they had the opportunity to receive some grant money, that obviously seems like a real upside, an opportunity, a bonus. They could improve their journalism department, et cetera. But instead of just receiving the grant money and an academic person or a finance person deciding that they were going to do that, and then turning to the risk manager and saying, okay, help us because do we need any additional insurance to cover this? So for this particular example, the grant money was going to be used to improve the journalism department and to send students pair them up with professional journalists and send them to places where news was happening. And in this particular case, that was likely going to be the border of U.S.-Mexico. And it is a pretty hot spot where this community college is located right now. A lot of violence, a lot of drug activity, and so there's a lot of news happening, right? But the issue of sending a student with a journalist to cover that is a little dicey. So I want to use that example because in a traditional risk management model, they would have made the decision and then turned to the risk manager and said, okay, help us. What do we need? Do we need student foreign travel? Do we need kidnap and ransom? Do we need waivers? Those would be the pieces that the risk manager would be providing and the input that the risk manager would be giving. And I'm not saying that's bad input. It's good. It's very, very important. But from an ERM perspective, what this client did was got a group of people together. There were 5 or 6 in the room, including the professor, including somebody from legal, including somebody from finance, including the insurance broker, including the risk manager, and other representatives, and they talked through what could happen if we accept this money. What would be the positive things? What we're going to be able to improve the standing of our journalism department and maybe hire more people, maybe draw new students. On the downside, we're sending 19-year-olds to pretty violent-prone places. What do we need to do about that? And so they identified both the upsides and the downsides. They decided to go ahead and accept the money, and then they identified for each risk, downside, adverse risk, they identified who can really help manage this, what can we do in response to it. So now what you're recognizing is they were going through that risk management process that's in the very far right of this slide. So I hope that that's a fairly clear example of the distinction between a traditional risk management approach and a broader, or what I would call enterprise risk management approach. As one quick aside, I do want to say that in this international standard, they don't call it enterprise risk management, by the way. They just call it risk management. I don't know that we're the only country that does that, but we do it more than any other country. And I think it's useful for us here because we've had such strong traditional risk management practices that have been grounded in the purchase of insurance and in industrial safety practices and that kind of thing. This is a broader, a new approach, so whatever you call it, it is a way to differentiate that what we're doing has a much broader application. So the adoption of, I'm so sorry, now I meant to answer the question that was posed. Where do controls come into play with the model, and is this risk residual risk after considering controls? So controls come into the model during the risk evaluation phase. So what you do, just to dive into that just a little more detail, is you identify or discover what risks there are. Then you have to find some way to analyze them to decide how often they're occurring. That's a commonly used one. That's a likelihood kind of rating basis. How serious they are if they do occur. That is sometimes called we used to call it severity. It's also called consequence. I like consequence better because it's not just dollars. It also might be bad press. It could be potential harm for others besides just your employees or people on your campus and so on. So consequences. It also might take into account, and the analysis might take into account things like velocity, like if something happened, how quickly would it blow up? And then how interlinked is it or interrelated is it to other things? And so you consider all of that during the analysis. But during the evaluation phase, what you're doing is you're saying, okay, we've analyzed this risk. We think it is, let's say, we've rated it on a scale of 1 to 5, and we've got a rating. So we're looking at now just the very highest ranked risks. If we're looking at those highest ranked risks, we are going to evaluate, are we doing enough to address those risks? So that's where the issue of what controls do we currently have in place? That's where we answer that question, and that's where we say, do we need more? Is it at an acceptable level? So we're really asking the question about risk tolerance at that point, and is it tolerable? Have we done enough? Do we need to do more? And then if we haven't, what more do we need to do? So you make a plan for doing that. That's where you step into risk treatment, which is the next box. And also you're looking at the residual risk is once we've applied, 2 or 3 or 5 controls, whatever they are, or 2 or 3 or 5 ways to try to manage or limit this risk. Let's say that this is a downside risk, right, an adverse loss. If we haven't done enough, what is left is really the residual risk. And so we need to do, what more do we need to do to bring it down to an acceptable level? So that's where that part of the discussion occurs. And I hope I answered that question sufficiently. If I didn't, and you have more, want to hear more or more detail, please write me another note. In the meantime, though, I'm going to move on and talk about adoption of ISO in the United States. It is, as I'm sure probably a lot of you are already familiar, it's a process. There's no coincidence that in the framework section it's a circle and it goes around and it goes around. We keep working on it, we keep perfecting it as we go. So yes, it takes a while to implement. My experience, I think it's 3 to 5 years, and it could be 3 years only if you've got people really intent and focused on it. Because it takes time, and it makes sense that it takes time, because you're really talking about trying to change people's view and understand how everybody is responsible for risk. And I know that that's a sort of byline of the program at UC, the UC system, which I really like, which is everyone is a risk manager. It takes time to get that word out for people to really understand it and understand how to implement it. So it takes a while. There's been a lot of interest in the U.S., particularly from some specific groups, ASIS, which is focused on security and information security, the resilience and recovery community and business continuity community is finding some very good and interesting links between ERM and this approach to help make sure that all potential effects of disasters are not only talked about and anticipated, but also planned for, and looking further than that, even to beyond recovery to resilience. So there's some very exciting work going on there, including, by the way, if you're in the Bay Area, Resilient SF has a pretty big project that is focused on this, so that may be of interest to some of you. For some people who are implementing ISO 31000, they do say that they appreciate that it's an international standard. It gives some more credence, gives some more comfort level to some of the decision makers or governing body members to know that this is something that really has a very high level of support across the globe. It also means that for some organizations that have, for example, operations in different countries, that you've got one standard that you're really looking to make sure that it is consistent in operations, whether they're in Italy or whether they're in South America or whether they're in the U.S. So for those of you with international campuses, that may be of some interest to you as well. I also wanted to mention that it's not, there is training available through the other IIA, the Insurance Institutes of America, which is called the ARM 57. So the ARM is the Associate in Risk Management Certificate, and there's for years and years there's been the 54, 55, 56 components of the ARM. Well, now they've added 57, which focuses on enterprise risk management. And you can find information about that online. You can get that certification if you're interested. There isn't any other ERM certification per se, at least not that I know of. If anybody knows of something I don't know of, please let me know. There are other conversations about enterprise risk management that happen, for example, in the finance, strictly the finance world, the finance community, and then of course in the internal audit world. And we're trying to make more of the links so that we're sharing language more, as opposed to, you have to look at 5 different standards and think about 5 different versions. And that's why it's so important that the IAA is participating as a liaison in our work for ISO 31004, which I'll talk about in just a couple minutes. Okay, so let's look at a comparison of just a few terms that come from ISO 31000 and from the ERM framework. And I think from this comparison, you'll see 2 things. First, sort of right off the bat, one is that they're really more alike than they are different. There's a lot of similarity. I think that the ISO 31000 standard is more streamlined. It's a more approachable body of work. It's easier to read and understand. It's a little more, in my opinion, a little more elegant. The ISO 31000, you can see, this is a restatement of what I had shown you earlier in a slide. The COSO ERM framework also says it's very broad. We intend it to apply broadly to lots of different types and sizes and shapes of organizations. The next comparison is the actual definition of risk management itself. In ISO, it is anything, really, any coordinated activity or anything that you're doing to direct and control an organization with regard to risk. I love it that it is so simple and so direct. I have to say I've known this COSO ERM framework definition for years, and actually my first ERM project was to implement a COSO model in a community college district, and I've struggled with it ever since then because I'm quite sure, as a former English major, I'm quite sure that there's a comma missing somewhere, and I'm not quite sure where to put it. But so I think it's harder to slog through it. But it is essentially trying to say it's applied broadly. It's a top-down implementation. That's important to it. If you are using this particular definition in any trainings that you're doing or when you're talking to people, I encourage you to take it apart, break it down, make it simpler if you really want to stick with the ERM version. But I think the ISO 31000 statement of how you define risk management is well put, and it's probably enough. Anyway, that's my bias. So now we go on to the definition of risk itself. In the COSO ERM framework, it's obviously very hooked to, although the COSO framework allows for opportunities to be considered or upside risk, this definition of risk still hooks it to anything that could adversely affect your objectives. I really like it that it's tied to objectives. I think that was a key, it's a cornerstone here of this new practice. But the ISO 31000 definition is really, risk is anything that can affect or has an effect of uncertainty upon your objectives. So I want to, and it's got that footnote there about an effect can be either positive or negative to try to hook into both opportunity as a part of this process as well. I like the ISO definition of risk because it encourages people to think widely about what might happen and not just look for potential dangers. So it encourages broader awareness about uncertainty as a whole. And I wanted to just talk through a quick example of that for you. So, we're having a lot of discussion about this and about the definition of this right now because we have this new international work group. But risk does not exist unless it has an effect, or it doesn't really matter unless it has an effect on your objectives. So, for example, for someone who, and it all depends upon your context as well. So, for example, if you're a swimmer and you're someone who likes to swim a lot, if you're swimming in the ocean, the potential that you could get attacked by a shark is something that you have to take into account. That's a context, right? I live in Minnesota. It's not something I'd have to worry about. But let's take something like, I know you can't see me, but you're going to have to take my word for it here, that what I've decided is that I need to get into better shape. And so my objective is that I'm going to work out. I'm going to go and I'm going to go swimming, because swimming is what I love to do. So I'm going to go swimming, I'm going to join a Y, I'm going to go swimming, I'm going to do it every day, and I'm going to get into better shape. Okay, so my objective is getting into better shape, exercising every day, improving my health. The uncertainties are around that are, do I know how to swim? Another uncertainty, maybe if you're in a small group, you could sort of name a few or throw them out. If we were in person, I'd have you call them out to me. But you know, I live in a house. I don't have a pool in my house, so I'm going to have to get to where there is a pool to go swimming. So it's uncertain, how am I going to get there, and will I be able to get there safely? And then when I get there, right, the uncertainties are around, will the pool be, the chemicals in the pool be safe to swim in? Will it be a safe environment, or am I going to be trying to swim laps in the middle of 100 crazy kids? So who are just doing rec swimming, So those are all uncertainties. The risks itself, to identify the risks are, if I were in Florida, naming this scenario, one of those risks would be, where will I swim and will it be safe for me to swim there, i.e. if I'm swimming in the ocean? Here in Minnesota, the risk would be, is the swimming pool safe for me to swim in, okay? Are there issues around me getting to the pool? Will I have to drive through some heavy traffic, or will I be able to drive safely to get there, that kind of thing. So I hope this kind of helps just work you through. You want to think about what the objective is. You want to you have to identify the context, what the objectives are, what the uncertainties are, and then the risks come from that. So I'm going to pause for a second. I see that someone asked a question. It had to do with getting the slides, so that's good. We will address that. Okay. I hope I didn't beat that horse too much, but I wanted you to think more broadly about what risk really means and all the different parts of it, because I do think people get confused about it. It is important to spend time on it. When I work with my clients, we spend a lot of time, once we get to identify what the risk is, we also want to talk about what the consequences of the risk are, because sometimes those get linked in there, and what the triggers of the risk are, or what the sources of the risk. So all of these are different aspects of it that help you understand it more deeply. So comparing the risk management process itself, you can see very, very similar. In the COSO ERM framework, it focuses more on internal environment, and in COSO, the context includes both internal environment, external environment, and stakeholders. And the setting of objectives, identification of the objectives, all of that is included in the context under ISO 31000. And in the COSO ERM framework, you're doing those things a bit separately. And then in the COSO model, you identify events. In the ISO model, we specifically do not use the word event because we think that's a little bit too limiting in terms of how you approach defining and describing risk. So in the process of assessing the risk, we identify them, we analyze them, we evaluate them. I've talked through that already. Then you figure out how you're going to treat the risk, and then you continually communicate and consult, and you continually monitor and review. And you're basically doing all of those things in the COSO model as well. So there's a lot more similarity than dissimilarity in the process itself. Question was posted about when the new COSO model will come out. I do not understand that there is going to be a new COSO model. So there's a new ISO model called ISO 31004, and we'll be talking about that in just a few more slides. If I have misinterpreted your question, please restate it for me, but there's not going to be a new COSO model that I know of. Okay, so I've got just 2 slides with some impressions of ISO and then some impressions of COSO. These come from just my casual, really, conversations. It's not anything statistical or didn't come from a survey, but practitioners across the U.S. really appreciate that ISO is to the point, it's very accessible, it's broadly applicable, that it's grounded in management and not just compliance, and that it's very strongly linked to objectives and to mission. And that I think it needs to do more, but it does a better job of addressing opportunity risks. I will say to the last bullet point on this slide that for a number of my clients, I urge them to use what works. Whether it's a piece that comes from COSO and it's a piece that comes from ISO and it's a piece that comes from the one of the Australia guides, great. If it helps you, use it and put it into play. Because in the U.S. we are not required to use any one particular model, and that's a real strength that we've got here. The next slide has got a few things that are missing from my perspective and also from what I've heard from others, that there needs to be more focus and intention around describing risk criteria. Risk criteria are, that's how you know whether you're managing your risk appropriately or not. It is a bit of, it ties into risk tolerance and risk appetite, and it is a definitive way to be able to say, yes, we have managed this risk to within a tolerable level, and we'll continue to do that, but we're satisfied that we've done enough. And risk aggregation, I think, is probably pretty self-explanatory. It's how they all add up together and how they cross over into silos, and that sometimes creates a greater risk than you would have in any individual unit or department. And then how risks are related to each other. And sometimes in the process of managing one risk, you may increase a risk in another area. And so it's important to be keeping that in mind as you're going through this process as well. We need more help with that and a little more help with key risk indicators. This last bullet point, that some consultants have a mandate to use COSO, in fact, it came from one specific organization trying to give some advice to people. What I would say is that if you were to hire one of the big consulting firms to help you implement enterprise risk management, then they may have their own process that they use. I highly suggest that you push them or you compare, especially if you're hiring consultants, make sure that you have them explain is this in concurrence with, if you've adopted ISO 31000 or COSO, whatever it is it in concurrence with this standard, and how will it support that? And I think that's an important question to ask. Okay. Some of the COSO definitions some of the COSO definitions be used within ISO 31004, I think is what the speaker or the questioner meant to write. I do not think that in the adoption of ISO 31004 we will be changing any definitions. So I think that my short answer to that is no. Now, I have just a couple of slides talking about global standards, just 2 or 3 of them. I'll go through them pretty quickly for you. This slide, in part, I think it helps to underscore why we needed ISO 31000, because these are all different standards in different countries that have to do with governance, and not just governance, but governance and risk. It's really both of those things. There are a couple that I will point out to you. In South Africa, and if any of you have any operations in South Africa, you're going to want to be very aware of this. There's something called the King 3 report, and it is focused on government, but it has a very nice section about the management of risk and who's responsible for what and how that relates to governance. So that's an important document if you have any operations at all there, and even if you don't, and that's something of particular interest to you, you might want to pick it up. I do believe it's available at no charge via the internet, so you can take a look at that. In the European Union, there is one governance model that's missing, which is Solvency II. That was adopted after this slide was developed, but I do want to mention that. And that really probably won't have anything to do with any of your operations because it focuses on insurance companies in the European Union and requirements related to risk and to financing. And then you could see if you read the slide looking at the very top, the international standards that apply to all countries are the Basel I and II and then the ISO models. And so it was an attempt to really try to help address all these. There are so many moving parts and variations related to risk. So ISO is trying to give this overarching approach to it. So thank you for the comments. I want to say it took a long time to put that slide together, but I'm glad somebody appreciated that. Here's the RIMS Crosswalk project. So RIMS, the Risk and Insurance Management Society, said there are a lot of models out here. How can we help our members kind of wind their way through these models? So they chose the 6 that are listed there and tried to describe the strengths and the weaknesses of each of them. And then what you have to keep in mind is they used as a point of comparison was the risk maturity model that RIMS developed. So I actually think it's a weakness that they started with the RIMS risk maturity model because that assumes that the risk maturity model is stands at the center and is the thing that everyone should be compared against. So that's my criticism of their approach to it, but it is helpful to see some of the comparisons and the strengths and the weaknesses, and it is available online at no charge. I do want to mention the BS 31100, which is the British standard, has already been updated, so this comparison is perhaps already a little bit out of date, but it's got helpful information in there if you're interested. And when you go to the RIMS site, you have to use these bullet points as helpers to get through to find the actual document. So you have to go to the Resources tab and then go to the Executive Reports tab in order to find it. But here is one chart that comes from that report that just compares what is the strategy focus. Is it on organizational objectives? Is it on compliance and controls? Or is it regulatory? And then it talks about which of the standards most closely complies or agrees with that strategy focus. So if you have a particular strategy focus on compliance and control objectives, for example, then you're going to want to look at the OSEG Red Book. You're going to want to look at COSO 2004. That doesn't mean there wouldn't be parts of ISO that wouldn't also be applicable, but this is to try to help you find your way through all the key standards that are out there. So to wrap this up, what we're doing next is we're working on an implementation guide to ISO 31000. It's going to be a fairly long process, about 3.5 years of meetings. We just had our first meeting about a month ago. It was created by the UK. This new project committee was created by the British Standards, put forth by the British Standards Institute. It's being managed by really somebody from Australia, somebody from Great Britain, and the secretary is from France. And right now we've got 30, I forget the number, I think it's 31 countries that are signed up and that are participating. We had about 22 countries physically attend the first meeting. What we're going to do is we're going to take the implementation guides that were created by individual countries, and you can see some of them listed there. I will tell you the one key one that's missing is Ireland, and I apologize for that, but it must have been late at night when I put this slide together or something. But the UK, Canada have created implementation guides. The Japanese implementation guide is only in Japanese, so don't go there unless you could speak Japanese. Austria and Australia and New Zealand have taken parts of the process and focused on them. And in Australia, for example, they've created handbooks. And in Austria, they have 3 different guidebooks. So Australia has a guidebook on risk communication. just focused on that topic, for example. So if you're interested in that, you want to go to the web and look for SAI, and that's the place where you can purchase the Australia or New Zealand standards or guidelines, handbooks. I'm sorry, that's what they call them, handbooks. Anyway, just FYI. You can also, if you have questions about any of these slides, you can also email me individually. I'd be happy to help if I can. I like to end my presentations with great quotes from great people, and I've included this one from Albert Einstein to help, I hope, sort of inspire us that we really need to try to expand our thinking. We need to try to think outside the box. We need to try to take a new approach, take a new view in order to manage the very real risks that we've got, very many pressing issues and competing interests and things that are pressing upon our objectives for all of our organizations. I also like to include this slide because the picture of Albert reminds me of what my hair looks like when I get up in the morning. So that's one thing that Albert and I have in common. And then in closing, I just want to give you my contact information. I am available. I do a lot of speaking on ISO and on enterprise risk management. I'm available for consulting, although this is not really a pitch for that at all, but also very happy to answer any questions that you've got or put you in touch with resources if I can do that. And I will just pause on my very long talking here and give folks a chance. If anybody wants to raise a question verbally, please do so now. And if not, I will turn it back to Emily. Thank you, Tim, for your comments.
All right. Thank you very much, Dorothy. Thank you, everybody. The recording of this webinar will be posted to our website within a day or two once we get it through our tech desk. If you would like a copy of the slides, please send me an email at emily.breed, emily.breed, @ucop.edu, and I will be happy to mail them to you. Thank you very much. Hope to see you next month.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.